What's up, guys? It's Terry
And Rowan.
and we're here from Artist Smart TV, bringing you another episode of
HSC Echo Review.
Now, last episode we saw you, Rowan and I did a very, very thorough, very comprehensive, very long deep dive looking really at evaluating the effectiveness of monetary policy in 2024. Now, I called it the Spotify Wrapped of monetary policy. Continuing on that theme, what we're going to do is we're going to switch sides now. In fact, I think it was probably in the chamber ready to go because Rowan in our monetary policy video was very, he had lots of praises to sing for Fiscal. I don't know if he realized this, but I was just sitting there like saying, when is the glaze going to end? And so what we've got here is we're going to do the same thing. So same structure as last time. So if you haven't seen the last video, I think it would be really, really good for you to go see that one first. So I think Rowan will work his magic.
So that you can, can get it, right? Or if you haven't, right, somewhere here, who knows,
But so go watch that one first. Once you're done, come back to this one. We're going to basically just do the same thing, but with fiscal policy. And so we're going to try and look at the pros. We're going to try and look at the cons. And in doing so, we're going to just build a discussion. Because as you may have seen in last year's HSC paper, there was a question that asked you to discuss the macro and micro regarding specific economic objectives. And I think one of the weaknesses that kind of came out of that marking criteria of those notes from the marking center is that students unfortunately are usually picking the side that they agree on. But it's a very important part of this course to also see the arguments for the side that you don't agree on. So you might think a certain way, but you've got to maybe try and at least just see both arguments and definitely have both of them on your page. Rowan, anything before we begin?
Perfect. No, I would just say, so the goal here is arguments for why fiscal's been effective in 2024, arguments for why it hasn't been effective in 2024. Mm-hmm. That'll enable you to create a more nuanced, sophisticated argument that you can take into essays, but also give you a framework so that you can evaluate fiscal in 2025.
Love it.
Cool. So let's jump in. I think maybe where to always start when you evaluate any policy is to look at the objectives. And I think what's important when you look at the objectives is not necessarily to just look at the textbook objectives, right, which we talked about in the monetary policy episode, where economic growth are 3 to 4% or inflation 2 to 3 or, unemployment, full employment at, 5% maybe you might even see, right? Like, ultimately, one of the things to do is to evaluate the policy on the basis of what they say they're going to achieve with the policy, which is often the forecasts that they're making. So I think where we should start really quickly with fiscal is to just do, what are they forecasting?
Oh, God.
Right? And then when we evaluate it, we can sort of say, well, are they on track or not here, right? So if we look at their objectives, they wanted to, if we look at the forecast for 2024 to 2025, they said economic growth is going to be at 2%. Now, 2025, the year is not out, right? We're obviously, we've only got 1 quarter of data, right? But that data is not looking like we're getting a 2%.
Nah.
So that's just something we can keep in mind as we go and evaluate the policy, okay? We've got unemployment at 4.5%. So, maybe there's some good stuff we can talk about there, when we talk about the pros. And, we've got CPI at 2.75, which is interesting because, again, when we start looking at some of the inflation data, we might end up being pretty close to that. So remember that when you're evaluating, we can go to the forecasts and evaluate to the forecast because that's the objective the policy is set out to achieve, not some broader objective. Now, you can at times, I think, still reference that broader objective, but actually, it's no point saying, well, fiscal policy failing to achieve the 3 to 4% economic growth target when it's never setting out in its policy objective here to get anywhere near that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add before we jump in? And
yeah, so maybe just something to speak more to what you were saying, Rowan, in terms of why maybe some viewers are going, well, why can't I do that? The issue is that, unfortunately, economics is a very complex subject where we're asking you to summarize very complex things in a very condensed period of time and space. And so while we're not asking you to consider every single factor out there that influences the achievement of a certain objective, it's important we recognize, I don't know if you used this term earlier, but that they don't exist in a vacuum. And unfortunately, just recognition of what some of those factors might be. So for example, you might have things that occur globally, you might have things that are conflicting objectives, you might have things that are political factors. And so all of those things will then factor in and give you a good idea of whether you've achieved your objective or not. And sticking, I guess, to just a very rigid binary tick box, yes, no, did I hit this number? I think willfully just kind of ignores all of that. And what you're then doing is you're leaving a lot of beautiful analysis, on the table.
And I think you're probably capping yourself in the band 5 zone, really, right?
That's it, yeah.
At the end of the day. So I think, if we're because I know some of you are probably listening being like, just tell me how to get that band fixed, right? We are.
That's a nice way of saying what you need to be doing.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, I think when we're evaluating, okay, we've got the objectives now, right? And I think that's probably a level of objective that a lot of students miss, right? Thinking about what the forecast is, right? And therefore that's what we're evaluating to. I think we should also acknowledge, well, what's the stance, right? Like, what is the fiscal policy setting, so to speak, that we're evaluating? So what do we have, Terry?
Yeah, so it's the magic number for this 2024-25 budget, which came out already, which you should know is we're looking at a deficit of 28.3 billion, and that's in a contrast to the two budget surpluses that we've had in the 2 financial years before that. So it was that kind of shifting from that contractionary stance back to that mildly expansionary stance. And the reason why we use the word mildly is you might go, well, 28 billion, that's a pretty nice chunk of change. However, relative to the size of the Australian economy, which is why we divide it by GDP, it's only about 1% of a deficit, which is still pretty good. I think from what you were saying in the monetary policy video, with that 1% of a deficit, they've been able to do a lot, right? And so it's nothing to scoff at, but it's not a significantly expansion. It's very mild.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's now make the case for why it has been effective in addressing economic growth. Sorry, not just economic growth. It's economic objectives. The first one being economic growth. So, where would we start here, Terry?
Yeah, so I think probably on a more positive note, as we were saying, than maybe in the monetary policy video. So we're going to go again up with using that idea that economic growth, while it hasn't been stellar, it's been at 1.5%, I believe we had in the previous video. The goal, as Rowan said, was 2% for the whole year. But it's not negative. Okay, I know we've said things which we might go through very quickly when we get to the other side, but of things like of per capita recessions. But the good news is, at the end of the day, we have had 0.3% positive growth in the September quarter 2024.
And when we look at what's been contributing to that, right, it's been largely in the AD formula, like G plus I plus C plus X minus M, all that sort of stuff, right? It's been the G.
It's been the G. The big G. I think it was 0.3% of that.
Yeah.
So within that 1.5%, 0.3% is coming from G.
Is exactly right. So it's probably been the biggest driver. And so you would argue economic growth's not amazing, but given very contractionary monetary policy, it's probably, the fact that it's only mildly expansionary as well, right? It's not very expansionary because it's trying to balance the inflation objective and not wanting to create too much overheating. It's probably doing a decent job at propping the economy up, and it's probably the thing that's preventing the recession, actually, right? So I think there's some positive to say there.
I think I'd borrow from something you said in the previous video, which is that they've done quite a lot with not very much. I think that's a nice way to put it.
That's true. Great. So let's keep moving. That's economic growth. Unemployment.
Yeah, so if you've come from the previous video, we know the stats for unemployment have been generally quite good. Okay, you also will know that my stance on this. Okay, but again, if we look at things, like I said, maybe apply a little bit of willful ignorance, and you just say, well, the labour market is strong, right? Unemployment at 4%, participation still at that record high of 67%. The underemployment at 6.2%, monthly hours worked has been increasing, right? So overall, I think things have been decent in the labour market, and you can, again, I think Rowan mentioned in the monetary policy video, because this is how much he loves fiscal. In the monetary, he was just talking about how good fiscal was. He said that through their spending, right, that unemployment was probably expected when GDP was flat. It was expected to probably rise by about 1.1%, which we know it hasn't. And so what was the figure you had?
It's 100,000. And I think, you could build on that by looking as well at the fact that while the private sector, annual average hours worked, right, has not really shifted, then the reason we're getting this sort of, good, labour market data is because the government sector is really driving a lot of employment growth still. Because we've also got a growing population. The thing we've got to also factor in is that, you get more people coming to the country, they start actively seeking work. This also speaks, I think, to a lot of our ability over the last year to very quickly integrate new arrivals into the labour force, right? And, so I think, you could argue again, maybe, there's some stuff we can argue on why maybe it's not as effective, but certainly for why it is that, well, it's probably, again, not monetary, but fiscal being the driver that's keeping unemployment, at historically low levels.
Can I ask a bit of another question?
Yeah.
Do you think there's potentially any other factors that have led to the government spending more and creating more jobs? Anything else that comes to mind?
You mean from like an automatic stabilizer perspective, or?
I have something in my head. I was just thinking, and this is probably just me being a bit silly, but is this the start of the aging population starting to take place?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mention that. I had that thought during the monetary policy, right? But it was like, it wasn't quite the right fit for that. And I was like, I'm talking too much about fiscal and the monetary.
Please, go ahead.
And my thought is it's interesting, right? Because obviously we are going to have a situation where we've got, a smaller like labour force at the end of the day supporting more and more people, which is why I think, at some level there's a necessity to keep importing labour, right? In terms of like working age labour. I'm not really sure, because at the same token, participation is very high as well. So, I don't know, do you have some thoughts? Like, I feel like there's something there, but I haven't got like the...
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think maybe we'll come back a few months and see where we're at.
Okay, cool. All right, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Right, we have some thoughts that maybe aging population is a factor here, and, but stay tuned.
Yeah.
Cool, so let's keep moving. What about inflation? Because I feel like, fiscal being mildly expansionary, when they announced that budget outcome, right, and stance,
yes,
there was a lot of hate.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Haters gonna hate.
There was a lot of hate.
Yeah.
Going like, this is going to be inflationary, right? It's going to drive inflation up. It's the exact worst thing that we need right now. What's happened?
Well, I would say, I think the haters have lost, in a sense. The haters need to quiet for a bit, because on that note, I do remember while there was a significant amount of hate, there was a smaller but still quite vocal minority of love, and I remember seeing, I do apologize, I can't give credit here, I do apologize, don't remember the name of the economist who came up with this, but I think they did say that they had ran some numbers and they said realistically, if it was going to be inflationary, it was only going to add about 0.1%, and so I think with the benefit of hindsight, we look at this and we go, what were we thinking? It was a mildly expansionary budget.
And if anything, right, we've just highlighted it's the thing that's keeping economic growth probably, and unemployment, right, like in the positions that they are. So if it hadn't been, imagine where we might have been, right?
So
I mean...
there needs to be a public apology, right?
I think,
So
which is interesting, because I feel like even now the government is being hammered, right, in the media around their fiscal policy settings.
Or banning social media. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's other issues as well, right? Maybe it's just, like a bit of a...
But that's what it is. It's a parliament.
Yeah, it's a parliament, right? But I think if we step away, there's some really good things that have achieved, right? And I'd probably go one further into highlight, because we raised it briefly in monetary, because we were talking about inflation there as well, that, the government rebates at the time... because there's two things that were occurring. They gave rebates, right? Electricity rebates, and they also had the stage 3 tax cuts. So it wasn't just the overall, mildly expansionary total outcome. It was also, wait a minute, there's some components in here that run the risk of being inflationary. And I think the thinking behind the rebates was that, in theory, they shouldn't be inflationary because it's not actually like giving someone cash. It's just reducing the cost of what they have to pay. Now, yes, that seems like the same thing, right? But it can have different impacts in terms of how it gets spent in the economy. We tend to, if we get cash, it's more likely that we spend it, where if we pay less for something, it's not as like we're then going out and spending more elsewhere, right? So the argument there was that shouldn't lead to as much inflationary pressure. There was some concern with the stage 3 tax cuts though, right? Now what's been fascinating is that the rebates though, now instead of creating inflation, are the things that have been arguably driving that headline inflation, that's 2.8%, right? If without the rebates, it's been argued that it would have been 3.2, right? So the irony is that it actually had the opposite effect than what a lot of the criticism was at the time. There's some other data, I think, that shows that, without the rebates, the cost of electricity would have been 36% higher. So, in June, for example, right, you would have been paying, if you excluded rebates, right, by August, I should say, you would have been paying $117, right, in terms of, where with the rebates, it was $86. So it's like quite a difference, in terms of the impact the rebates are having. So I think, you could certainly argue, okay, hey, it's reducing the inflationary pressure, and there's probably more to say about the stage 3 tax cuts, and I'm going to throw them to you, Terry.
So I was just thinking about this as you mentioned the stage 3 tax cuts. I do think back, right? Like, I was a beneficiary of the stage 3 tax cuts. I was happy to some degree, right? Like, I think most people. I think that's an important thing to think about in terms of nuance, is that people can make a big song and dance about something, but at the end of the day, it helped them, right? But go back to this. I think there was this concern, right, that there would be an increase in demand pool inflation specifically. This idea, I think you mentioned earlier about, well, people are more likely to go and spend money.
Because they're getting cash back, right? Like, in terms of, the difference is, I think, when you do your tax, right, like, if you haven't paid enough, you've got to pay some. But if you paid more, right, you're getting some money back. And a lot of people do that. They get the tax back at the end of the year, and they're like, great. What can I go and spend on, right? Like, I have this thing I was hoping to buy, and I was going to use my tax money for it.
Well, I have two kind of arguments revolving around that. The first one, I'll stick to the script, then I'll go off script after that. So the first one is that, as we discussed earlier, that household consumption has just been absolutely pathetic. So I think we've had something like, I think it's fallen 0.6% for the year, and that's with consideration of the fact that the population has grown about 2 to 2.5%. So if you didn't have population growth, God knows what household consumption would have been even further down the list. So that's the first thing, is that the initial concern that people would basically funnel the cash through the tax cuts straight to consumption has simply not materialized, and that therefore has created less inflationary pressure and a better inflationary outcome for the government. My kind of off script one is that, well, fundamentally, I think, Rowan, to go back to that point you just had, which is that this isn't really no longer, like, if we're going to start talking about people's behaviour, it's no longer just a conversation about policy in a vacuum. We need to understand the profile of the average Australian household. And I think when we saw with the RBA how kind of off the mark some of their predictions were, and sometimes some of the comments they put out can appear to be quite tone deaf in terms of, and I don't say that to be offensive, I just mean that truthfully, right? That perhaps there is also there's been a fundamental misunderstanding of where the Australian household is nowadays, right? Like, so that if I speak on myself, right, for example, I got more money from stage 3 tax cuts, and it made absolutely no change to the way that I consumed.
And I think it makes sense, because you're thinking about how everything's getting more expensive, right? You're thinking, well, this is going to come in handy, not for like going and splurging on something, but just, I've just got daily expenses, and it's just gonna help contribute to that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. I think that's why we're not seeing this like bump, right? This expected bump that often that's why they like giving tax cuts, right? As well, because there's often this expected bump that flows through in consumption, in economic growth. And we certainly haven't seen that, because if we look at the economic growth figures, right, that was 0.3% for the September quarter. That's the first quarter after the stage 3 tax cuts, right? So, that's possibly an argument about the effectiveness of the stage 3 tax cuts in contributing to economic growth. So that's maybe a good segue about the case of the limited effectiveness, right, of fiscal policy in addressing the objectives, because you could argue that the stage 3 tax cuts were part of the government's expansionary component, right? Yeah. That they were hoping not to have too much of an inflationary impact, but use it to drive consumption in the economy.
I remember at the start of the video, we said that they were forecasting 2% economic growth, right? And so
if we come back to that, precisely, right, where we're not there, And now, we've got time, but everything's pointing that growth's sort of going the other way, right?
Yeah. Can I just jump in before we move to the other side? Like, some clarification on perhaps, like, I don't know exactly why are people saving their tax cut rather than spending. I think this then borders into other realms of thinking apart from just economics, right? But I think fundamentally there needs to be a consideration of what people are prepared to put up with, and to that extent of, if you have what we've had in the past, let's just say 4 years, right? Perhaps a tax cut would have been more effective had it been given at a time that wasn't COVID followed by post-COVID. That's all I'm saying. So I think there needs to be a consideration of, I think you're right, like we have sticky inflation, we have sticky wages, but perhaps we even have sticky MPCs and sticky MPSs in this. If you clarify, what I'm saying is sticky marginal propensities to save, in that people don't react the way that our models are predicting as quickly
But I also wonder if the reason is to do with future expectations, right? Like, one thing we haven't talked about in either of these episodes, I think, is the role that expectations play. And so I think a lot of our, decisions about consumption and saving turn on what our future expectations are for economic activity, right? And so I would have to imagine that, a lot of households right now are probably not looking... I mean, broadly, I think some of the consumer confidence data has been edging slightly upwards, right? So there's been some slight, and that was it jumped particularly when the stage 3 tax cuts came through. So there was a little jump in consumer confidence, but it's still pretty low.
Yeah.
Right? It is still a lot lower than what you'd be wanting. And so I suspect that's part of the issue as well, is that a lot of households are looking at the future going, well, we don't think things are going to be getting easier anytime soon.
Yeah.
Right? And then that's then going, well, we're going to save, right? That sort of defined it. So I suspect that's probably a pretty big factor as well. And that's harder to shift, right? Expectations take time to shift. And that speaks to your point around the stickiness then, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's jump in and look at the case of limited effectiveness, and we've sort of touched on a little already as we've been highlighting. I might jump in with the first one, and then I'm going to throw to you, Terry, for the next one. I think, at the end of the day, one of the sort of concerns is we have a structural deficit for our, fiscal policy. And so what that means just, essentially is that the nature of our revenue and expenditure is such, right, that into the sort of medium to long term, there is going to be just forecast deficits, right? Unless we're making changes to how we generate revenue or considerable changes to how we're spending on sort of long-term expenditure sort of, like categories, we're going to keep having deficits. And that's obviously concerning because of that sustainability. Not immediately, but it's the sustainability issues that it creates over the long term, particularly around, the percentage of debt to GDP. And so the challenge, I guess, is that already, based on, because we've got a bit of data already coming through, right? What's happened is that revenue has already softened for the government, right? So, because economic growth is slower, automatic stabilizers kick in, right? They're getting less revenue from net exports. They're getting, less sort of company tax and PAYG tax and all of those benefits, right? They're less, right? And so the reality is that the deficit is actually going to be 5.2 billion larger, right? So that number that was, 28 before that Terry was saying is now expected to be 33.5, right? So it's expected to go from 1% of GDP, negative 1%, to negative 1.2%. So we're getting a slight worsening. So the point here is this budget already is a criticism that it originally had was that it wasn't doing anything to really address any of the structural issues. It was very much considered to be a bit of an election budget. The budget prior to the next election, we'll put some tax cuts through, we'll make everyone happy, we won't try to cut any major expenditure, we won't tax any major, we won't change any major structural reform. And what we're sort of seeing is, well, okay, that structural deficit was already there and it's just going to get a bit worse. And that's going to probably flow on, to the tune of, I think they've identified 16 billion over the next 4 years, right? Greater structural deficit than what's otherwise forecast. So I think that sort of probably speaks a little bit more to the external stability objective, right? Which often can get left out, but probably fiscal's the one that, it's hard to, I think, talk about monetary.
Yeah.
But certainly fiscal you can. Does anything you want to add to that before we sort of keep moving?
I was just going to make sure that at the end we got to external.
Yeah, we tied it in. Yeah. Cool. So great. What else could we argue here, Terry, around maybe where it's not been that effective?
Yeah. So I think we've kind of touched on this one already, and I think you were saying that you could tie this in, I guess, as a criticism of the ineffectiveness of the tax cuts, right? Which the intention is, of course, to stimulate economic activity through consumption. Unfortunately, the numbers at the moment are just not really supporting that, right? Yeah. And so we've spoken about the fact that GDP growth in the most recent quarter was 0.8% for the year.
Yeah.
But on a per capita basis, it's actually gone backwards 1.5%. And I think when we talked about in the monetary policy video, it's been doing that for over 12 months now, right?
Yeah, every quarter, it's just getting a little bit worse, a little bit worse.
So just to go back and explain, just in case, did I say at the start of the video what per capita recessions were?
You did, yes.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
But yeah.
And so that really highlights. And I think what's interesting is if you then layer on the fact that this deficit just got $5 billion bigger.
Yeah.
Right? Because of revenue changes, right? So it's become, it's not significantly more expansionary, but it's you know, like 1/5 of a percentage point more expansionary, like, and we're seeing this happen. It's like, yeah, it probably indicates, well, maybe it needed to be a little more actually, but it's a tricky balance, because on the one hand we're saying, well, you know, we've got a structural deficit here.
Yeah.
You know, like, should we be spending more, guys? You know, like, what's going on? But then on the other hand, we're saying, oh, but, you know, economic growth is not where it needs to be. Like, get in and spend some stimulus, right? So I think what this really also highlights is just the real, like, how real the conflict of objectives is.
Yeah. And then I think to kind of play that pessimist role here, it's like, are we just going to basically fail at 2 objectives at once?
Yeah, rather than just pick one and win, right? It's just like, guys, just pick one, please. Which I think, to be fair, has been, I think, one of the challenges for Labor, you know, in a political limitation that we can layer on, right? Yeah. Because Labor has had a reputation for a very long time of not being good, like, fiscal managers. And Liberals, you know, when it goes to the elections, that's one of their big, like, attack messages, right? And so Chalmers certainly, you can see that a lot of, like, the way that fiscal policy has been framed in this first term, right? I mean, it may be, they may get a second, who knows, right? But certainly in this term has been with that in mind. Like, how do we get surpluses so we can say, hey, Labor doesn't just do deficits, we do surpluses, and the only 2 that we've had in a good period of time, right? And it feels like that's sort of the problem, is that they're trying to go, hey, well, let's, like, sort of look good there, because politically we want to get re-elected.
And that's those political constraints, right?
And then, but we're not really doing enough on either to make a material impact, but it's enough to look good, right? You know, like, to paper over the cracks, basically.
And I don't want to understate how important that is. To what degree within the current system that we have, is it important to do a good job or to look good doing the job?
And I think, with 3 years, I mean, this is, you know, like a much bigger conversation about, well, how long are the terms, right? Like, I think it's 3 to 4, 3-year terms, I think, and then they have to call the election.
They'll call the election.
Yeah, right? So I think, you know, it's why, you know, that the US would argue, well, that's why you want 5 years, right? You know, because the challenge is the shorter that term length, the greater the sort of election cycle creates political limitations, because you've got such a short window of time to push something through that's potentially unpopular but needed, in the hope that you can then sweeten the deal with a couple of nice policies at the back end and then get re-elected, right? So you've got some real limitations in how you do that, and yeah, it just, I think, impacts the sort of willingness of governments to take on bigger reform.
Let's just knock all of them out. So that also speaks to time lags as well, because I was just thinking, well, potentially, like, if we go back to the stage 3 tax cuts, and we spoke a little, I spoke quite at length of this about potentially the expectations revolving around people's marginal propensity to consume. Maybe
it's too early.
Maybe that's right. Like, maybe now, because of how cautious people are and because of what people have experienced over the past 4 years, maybe in the way that you guys will understand, you've got to let it cook for a bit. Right? You've got to let, like, a policy, we cannot just simply evaluate something. Like, it is early days, right?
Yeah.
We can't look at something and go, that's had a pretty poor quarter, and therefore it's
done.
It's done, right? Yeah. So
chuck it in the bin.
Yeah. So don't forget that that kind of impact lag as well, right? Something you can definitely mention.
And I think, just to go to that point, Terry, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, a lot of people, you know, they're almost like holding their breath, waiting for that cash rate to come down a notch.
Oh yeah.
And then, you know, it's like, because it's I think that's the thing that probably will start resetting expectations, to be honest. I don't think it's fiscal policy, right? I think a lot of expectations, and the RBA knows this, why they jawbone as well. I think they know that it plays a critical role in expectation setting. I'd say that the other thing to highlight about maybe why fiscal is not as effective as we think is we talked about how it's been doing a great job propping up unemployment, right? But on the flip side, right, like, the problem is the market sector is not really going very well, right? Like annual hours worked is, like, flatlining. And so it's propping it up in the way of going, well, we're going to spend money to prop it up, not necessarily in, hey, let's drive the underlying economic sort of, you know, conditions here that create a situation where the private sector picks up more of the slack. And so what I've really started seeing more recently, Terry, I don't know if you've sort of caught it, is this sort of almost emergence of a bit of a two-speed economy, right? Like, private versus government sector, in that the private sector is really slowed, right? And there's very different conditions in the private sector versus the public sector, right? Which is, you know, getting more investment as the government, both state and federal, right? But particularly federal have been stepping in. I think there's an argument to say, therefore, that our underlying indicators here for the labour market are not as strong as it seems on that superficial reading. And again, that just speaks to maybe the fact that, you know, fiscal policy isn't as effective as it appears to be.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think what you see is that, as you're saying, it's spending. However, it's not really kind of structurally changing.
Yeah.
It's not spending that's going to cause structural change in the areas that you need. It kind of papers over the cracks, if you will.
It's like the sugar hit, right?
That's
Almost
right,
a little
that's
bit.
right,
It's like
yeah.
it gets you there for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Election comes.
Yeah,
Me being a little cynical, right?
That's a good one, but I think that's a really good metaphor for them, just to kind of
Yeah.
remember as the new budget comes through next year.
Yeah, no, that's right. Perfect. What's the final, and there's a couple under this one, right? Because I think there's a lot in this piece. But what's the final argument maybe that you could make, right, about, and whether or not this is all fiscal policy's fault? That's a big question, but we can certainly bring it up.
But I think I guess where I would segue into this is because when you look fundamentally at what gets governments elected, right? We've seen what we've seen over in the United States recently in November of 2024. I think for me, what really kind of solidified and won that election, if you will, is what the average household is experiencing, and more specifically things like cost of living and also disposable incomes. So when you combine all those things together, you're looking at what are their income levels and what are their living standards at the moment. So to give you some data, basically we've got some very, very significant issues with household disposable income on a per capita basis. It's actually gone backwards, and it's actually been going backwards for 2 years.
Yeah, it's gone back for some time. Yeah,
and then also as has been very well documented for the past 2 years, three years even, is that the living standards have dropped. Cost of living has shot up. And so I think the big one is rent has continued to rise actually faster than wages. What's interesting about this one is
almost double. Like, so if you're we're in Sydney, right? Rents in Sydney have gone up 8.1%, wages 4.2%.
What I always find really interesting about the conversation about this one is that I might get cancelled for saying this, so I'm going to say, but I think there was during that kind of COVID period there was those rent freezes.
Oh, of course, yeah, I agree, right? And so in some respect, we're seeing if there'd been like an annual rate that had sort of averaged out, the annual rate averaged out is actually not particularly crazy, right? But it's how it gets felt.
But that's right, And so the people that were renting, and I think we speak about how many new people, like how many migrants have jumped over to Sydney. So just because rents were frozen during COVID, there's been a lot of people that have come in post-COVID or have moved post-COVID who probably, it's a very real experience for them.
Yeah, that's right.
They've experienced that pain. Don't cancel me.
I think I think some of the data shows that I think household living standards have fallen as far back as 2015, 2016 levels, right? Real wage growth, we've seen a little uptick, right? Great, which has been fantastic, because that speaks to it. If you use a cost of living index, which factors in like mortgages, right? It's actually in the red, right? Significantly. Now, the point here is, can you lay all of this to the feet of the government? Well, sort of yes and no, right? The no is, well, we're talking about a very short time lag, very short, not time lag, but very short time period from when this budget is implemented. So again, some of these are going to take time. Like some of these are structural in nature. Like in the case of rents, well, it's because we've got a population growth that's outstripping our ability to build quick enough, right? We've got not as many new dwellings being built. So there's some structural stuff that is going to take time for the government to deal with. I think you could argue that. And there's data that shows that they're behind on a lot of the sort of initiatives around the sort of commitments they were making to build, right? Whether or not it's social housing or just new homes. And so you can argue, okay, well, we can't, this is sort of looking backwards, right, over the past year, right? Whereas, this budget's only been in place, for half the year, right? Give or take. So we can't completely lay the blame, but we can already start to say, well, it's not looking like they're going to be hitting that one out of the park with the issue with, just property supply, right? We can say that, yes, they recommended to the Fair Work Commission in terms of, I think it was a 3.75% award wage increase, right, that flows across the economy. So, they've done some stuff there around supporting that to try to support wage growth. Obviously they've done some things to deal with cost of living, right, to support, the issues around, the impacts that are having. But at the same token, are they doing enough to make a real dent? You could probably say no, right? Really, right? Like, again, it's a little bit of that. It's like the difference between what looks good, between what's actually maybe going to make a significant difference. And so I think, you could definitely argue that with a bit of bite to say, look, we can't blame them for everything. Because a lot of this is pre this budget, right? There are structural issues, there's other stuff going on, but we can sort of suggest that maybe what's currently in place and the early data indicates it's not on track.
Yeah, I think it might come across that Rowan and I are being quite harsh of the government, but I think it's important to kind of go all the way back and reconsider what the purpose of fiscal policy is and what the purpose of a government is. It's not the same as what monetary policy is.
Yeah.
Monetary policy has a very narrow focus. Unfortunately, right, in the case of the government, they have a very broad focus. If you go back to what objectives they basically hit in your course, for example, they hit basically everything.
Yeah.
Traditionally, I think sometimes they've wanted to kind of get inflation out of that, but you look at what they've been working on, and you can't argue that they don't have a role to play now in everything.
Yeah.
Right, and we haven't even spoken about the environment here.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, they have a very, very broad focus, but we can only evaluate things based on what they are. And if you have a very broad focus, then you not only have to focus on the short term and the long term, as Rowan said. Unfortunately, that's what people are going to assess your success on.
That's right.
Yeah.
So fantastic. So there we go. We've done, I think, a pretty detailed evaluation on fiscal policy as well. Once again, the hope is that it's given you, a framework that you can use as 2025 rolls on, and the time lags, and start to sort of become clearer in terms of impact, right? You'll have a framework that you can use to evaluate. But certainly my hope as well is that what it's given you is a way to realize how you can unlock those Band 6, right?
That's right.
Whether or not it's to discuss and analyze, right? But certainly for those, higher order sort of verbs and slightly more challenging questions, to really score those top marks, you're needing to have a more nuanced approach to both the pros and the cons, so to speak. Is there any final comments, Terry, before we wrap?
Oh, I think I would just say some of you might think, well, what if there's ever a policy that comes out that is only ever good or only ever bad? What I would say is that's unfortunately not very realistic. Yeah. There's always going to be benefit. There's always going to be good and bad.
There's always opportunity cost, to put it into economic terms, right?
Yeah.
There's always a trade-off at some level.
That's right. It's almost the way that things are set up in this course almost invites you. So I would just say go out there, be courageous, be confident, have a go. I think one of the worst things you can do in this course is to not have a go.
Yeah.
And only just take things at a very basic surface level.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think what I would sort of say to that, just as a final point as well, is that I think you'll be rewarded for having a go, right?
That's right.
Even if sometimes maybe the final evaluation that you make is maybe not perfect or a little off.
And we don't expect it to be.
It's the thinking that sits underneath it, right? That's actually going to get rewarded.
Yeah.
And so I think, it's for sure worth starting to put that in practice. Certainly, if you're watching this early in 2025, right? You've got time to practice this before the time you get to your trials and your HSC as well.
Yeah. And if you need any kind of further assistance on that, I highly recommend go seek out Rowan's team here at Artist Smart. They will look after you. 100%.
Cool. I'm actually leading a class in 2025. So, hey, you can hang out with me for more if this long episode is not already enough.
Never enough, Rowan.
Yeah, brilliant. Amazing. If you have any questions, guys, let us know in below. If you haven't hit subscribe already, do so. Otherwise, we'll see you in our next episode.
See ya.